If you think you've got a handle on the Nikon Z5II exposure modes, the P, S, A, and M modes, there's actually a whole lot more you can do if you customize various exposure functions. And this video is going to take you through that. We're going to go into the custom settings menu, that huge menu with the big long list of items in there, and we're going to go through and see how we can customize the Z5II exposure system, customizing things like the controls and how the camera meters, auto exposure lock, and all of the different shutter types. This video is a free preview from my Z5II tutorial course. This course contains 4 hours of video. You can go back and rewatch each video topic whenever you'd like. Read the text that goes along with each video to pull out the important points. There's a couple of PDF downloads for offline reference, and there's even a quiz at the end of the course. You can watch even more free previews from that course at photocourses.link/Z52. And if you do want to go ahead and enroll in the full course, you can save 20% with the coupon code TUBE20. So here it is, how to customize your exposure system in the Z5II. In this lesson, we're going to see some ways that we can customize our exposure system to get away from the defaults, much like we did with our focus settings. And as a reminder, anytime you change any of these custom settings away from the default, you'll see the little asterisks next to that designation to let you know that it's been changed. First is ISO sensitivity step value. Here you'll choose whether your ISO is adjusted in third stops for more precision or whole stops to be able to more quickly change your ISO. And whatever option you set here, that's going to take effect in both the ISO sensitivity setting menu and on your screen whenever you're changing the ISO via the button or the touchscreen. And here's that quicker selection with whole stops set. Whole stops may be easier here. You can always really refine your exposure using shutter speed and or aperture. In EV steps for exposure control, you'll choose whether you adjust your aperture, shutter speed, exposure and flash compensation, and bracketing in either third or half stops. Third stops is kind of like the standard. It allows for more precision, as we see here, adjusting our aperture and then our shutter speed. But half stops can help you adjust those settings faster, as we see here again. Or you could choose 1 EV steps, compensation 1/3 EV, and in this case, you're going to adjust your shutter speed and your aperture in whole stops. And this doesn't really give you a lot of refinement for those variables. However, you can still adjust your exposure compensation in third stops. Easy exposure compensation is where you can turn off the need to push that exposure compensation button and hold it while rotating the main command dial to change your exposure compensation, as we saw a few lessons ago. If you turn this setting on, all you need to do is just rotate the dials to change your exposure compensation without having to hold down the button. This is not available in manual exposure modes. So if you set it to on auto reset, you'll use the command dial to change the exposure compensation. And then when you cycle the power, that exposure compensation is going to be reset to 0. If it's just on, you'll again use the command dial to change your exposure compensation. And then when you cycle the camera power, the camera is going to save whatever value is set. Or you could turn it off so that you do need to hold down the exposure compensation button while rotating the main command dial. And that could be useful so that you don't accidentally change your exposure compensation by hitting one of those dials. The command dial that you are going to use to change your exposure compensation is going to depend on the exposure mode that you're in. It's going to be the command dial that is not the one that you're using to change the exposure variables for that exposure mode. And if you just want an easy way to see which command dial you use to change your exposure compensation, you can go to the Custom Settings F2 submenu and then go to Dials, and it's going to show you whether you use the sub command dial or the main command dial in each of the exposure modes. If you do want to use this feature, I'd recommend setting on so that it doesn't reset every time the power is cycled. Matrix metering face detection is going to apply if you are in the matrix metering mode and using subject detection. When this is on, as it is by default, the exposure is going to be adjusted for human faces when they are detected by the camera. Now, this can make it easier to get a proper exposure on a face, but it can also surprise you if you're doing other things with your exposure and it suddenly changes when a face is detected. That's why I prefer to keep it off to just preserve that matrix metering however I set it, whether or not a face is detected. In center weighted area, you will choose the size of the center weighted priority area when center weighted is set for the metering mode. If you set it to small, that center weighted area is going to be approximately a quarter width of the screen. Standard is going to be a little bit larger, about 1/3 of the width of the screen. And then average is going to effectively turn off the center weighted area and instead use a basic average of the entire screen for metering. I prefer standard here to have a more usable, a larger center weighted option. Fine tune optimal exposure will let you set an exposure compensation offset for each metering mode. For example, if you want the highlight weighted metering to give you brighter highlights than what the camera normally meters for, you can set that to, say, plus 3/6, which is 1/2, but you're going to be adjusting all of these in 6. And you can set offsets from -1 to +1. When you do have an exposure compensation offset for any of the metering modes, you are not going to see the exposure compensation icon because there is an offset programmed. Moving into the C group, C1, shutter release button auto exposure lock. That's going to set whether or not the exposure is locked with the shutter button, with the half press. We mentioned that in the last lesson. The default value is off, which is different from how nearly every other camera is set up. In most other cameras, if you press the shutter button halfway, it's going to lock the exposure. Off is not going to do that. You'll need to use another button to lock the exposure. If you do want the exposure to lock when you half press the shutter button, you have that option here. Or if you want the exposure to lock when you are doing a burst mode, you can set on for burst mode. The exposure is not going to lock when it's pressed halfway, but when you press the shutter all the way to capture a burst of photos, then the exposure will lock. My own personal preference is to set this on with the half press, which is what I've been used to for the past couple of decades with all of my other cameras. Self-timer is where you'll program the self-timer function when the release mode is set to self-timer. You can set a delay of 2, 5, 10, or 20 seconds, and then set the number of shots that the timer is going to create when that timer expires. You can set from 1 to 9 photos when using the self-timer. And if you're doing a group portrait, higher numbers can give you more options if people are going to blink or not smile or look away, as they inevitably do. And then if you are capturing more than one photo at the end of that timer delay, you can set the interval between each one of those photos from a half a second, a whole second, 2 or 3 seconds. As an example setup, if you're doing group photos that you are going to run into, you can set the 10-second timer with 5 photos and a half-second interval. Or if you're doing long exposures and you want the camera vibrations to dampen after you press the shutter button, you can set a 2-second timer with 1 photo. These options can also be changed directly in the I menu under Release, if that's one of your I menu options. C3 power off delay is going to choose how long the displays will remain on after the last camera operation in whatever operation mode you're in. And you can set power off timers for playback mode, when you're in the menus, when you're reviewing pictures, And then the standby timer is going to set how long the displays remain on after the shutter button is pressed halfway. The exposure delay mode is very similar to the self timer, but it should really only be used by photographers who exclusively do long exposure photography. Because when anything but off is selected here, the shutter release is going to be delayed for whatever time is set after pressing the shutter. Now, this can allow time for any vibrations to settle if you're triggering the exposure by hand, but remember that there will be a delay for every single photo until this is turned off. You don't want to be surprised when you're trying to capture some magical moment and then suddenly you're having to wait a half a second before that exposure is made. Shutter type is where you will choose which type of shutter is used to start and stop the exposure. If set to auto, the camera is going to choose between either the mechanical shutter or the electronic front curtain shutter based on the shooting conditions, primarily like your shutter speed. If you just want to use the mechanical shutter only, you can set that here, and the maximum shutter speed available is 1/8000th of a second. If you want to use the electronic front curtain shutter, where the exposure starts with the electronic shutter and ends with the mechanical shutter, you can set that. However, here the shutter speed will be limited to 1/2000th of a second. And if you want to learn more about how the electronic shutter works and when you might want to use it, I've linked to an article in the notes for this lesson that explains that. The only way to select the electronic only shutter is to go into silent mode in your setup menu. Extended shutter speeds. As we mentioned in the previous lesson, you are limited to exposure times of 30 seconds in manual exposure mode. If you want to set exposures longer than 30 seconds, you need to enable extended shutter speeds. So turn this on, and when you're in manual exposure mode, now you can set exposures up to 15 minutes long. There are certainly a lot more custom settings to go through, and we'll get to them as we learn about the functions related to those settings. But in the next lesson, let's take a look at how to do burst photography,